You think you belong here serving people? Go home and weep, you pathetic. The insult echoed across the packed restaurant, his voice dripping with disdain. His cruelty didn't stop at words. He pushed the wheelchair violently. She tumbled to the floor. Hot coffee splashed across her blouse. Her possessions scattered everywhere. A delicate handkerchief, a treasured military photograph, and a fragment of dignity shattered. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody uttered a word. They all diverted their gaze, pretending the incident never happened, and she silently collected each item with quivering fingers. But half an hour later, a military transport vehicle roared into the parking area. Three United States Marines emerged, pristine uniforms, gazes firm as iron. They said nothing at all. They simply advanced forward, and everyone in the restaurant rose to their feet. Welcome to Heartfelt Chronicles, where narratives of empathy and benevolence unfold. Let's discover what actually transpired. Pine Ridge, Montana, 4:03 in the afternoon. Jessica McMillan had polished the same counter section 5 consecutive times, but her thoughts were elsewhere. At merely 21, she'd only been employed at the Freedom Bell Eatery for half a year, yet it already seemed like an extension of herself. The sound of silverware clinking, the aroma of sizzling onions, the entryway chime that always rang slightly too loudly. This community wasn't recognized for excitement. It was known for quietness, for military veterans who came back from conflict zones and remained reticent, for residents who avoided inquiries unless they were offering dessert. And that's why Jessica detected her presence immediately when she wheeled in during every shift. Margaret Dawson, though everyone addressed her as Maggie, 5 decades old, but her gaze carried the weariness of several lifetimes combined. A former Marine staff sergeant who had endured an improvised explosive device in Afghanistan, though not without sacrifice. She'd sacrificed her left limb. The artificial replacement was awkward, unmatched, and deteriorated, and she never attempted to conceal it. Maggie visited thrice weekly for part-time employment, arranging napkins, cleaning tabletops, brewing the most robust coffee in the region. She functioned methodically, but her presence carried significance. No idle chatter, no grievances, no vulnerability. Jessica admired her greatly. Maggie occupied her customary corner table, folding napkins into perfect triangular shapes. Her wheelchair was secured beside the booth, the prosthetic limb barely visible beneath her denim pants. Then the doorway bell clanged forcefully. 4 men stormed in, their laughter immediately excessive, boots stomping as if they owned the establishment. Jessica recognized trouble instantly. The largest swaggered as if still in military training. Mid-30s, crew cut, scarred above his mouth. She recalled spotting him previously, loudmouthed at the fuel station. Rumors suggested he'd been expelled from service dishonorably. Named Brent Wallace, if her memory served correctly. Someone who believed uniforms granted authority even after losing the privilege to wear one. Well, look who we've got here. A battle-scarred hero, Brent declared, nodding toward Maggie without lowering his voice. Jessica's stomach nodded. Maggie continued folding napkins, ignoring them. Wheelchairs should remain at home, one of Brent's companions snickered. No reason to spoil a decent meal. Jessica stepped away from behind the counter, heart racing. Can I assist you with finding seats? Brent grinned. Sure thing, darling. Somewhere close enough to watch Little Miss Soldier pretend she's still valuable. Maggie's hands continued their task. Sir, I'd appreciate if you kept your remarks respectful, Jessica stated, voice slightly unsteady but determined. Brent leaned closer, alcohol fumes heavy on his breath. You one of those sensitive types defending the broken and wounded? No, sir, Jessica replied, maintaining composure. I'm simply trying to keep the atmosphere pleasant. He scoffed and selected a booth 2 tables from Maggie. His companions followed, their footwear scraping against the floor tiles. The establishment grew hushed. The elderly gentleman at the counter averted his gaze. A pair of high school students who had been giggling over milkshakes suddenly found their straws fascinating. Nobody spoke. Maggie completed the napkin folding and gradually wheeled toward the newcomer's table, her posture erect, shoulders level. Would you gentlemen prefer menus? She inquired, voice unwavering. Brent smirked. Sure thing, wheels. Roll them over here. Jessica winced. Maggie arranged the menus neatly on the table, turning to depart when Brent's arm extended and seized her wrist. So, you're genuinely a Marine, huh? He sneered, noticing the faded Corps emblem visible beneath her rolled sleeve. Let me guess. Administrative duties, right? Filing paperwork while real soldiers fought battles. Jessica moved from behind the counter, but Maggie's voice halted her. Release my arm, she stated calmly, hardening her tone. Brent laughed and shoved her arm away. Or what? You'll run me over with that chair. One of the men behind him laughed so hard he snorted. Jessica's hands balled into fists. She glanced around, but Dave, the manager, was nowhere visible, naturally absent. As Maggie turned toward her wheelchair to leave, Brent extended his foot and blocked one wheel. Did I dismiss you, Marine? Jessica was already halfway to their table when it happened. One of the other men, the heavy-set individual with patchy facial hair, stood and walked behind Maggie. He grabbed her wheelchair handles. Without warning, he pushed forcefully. The wheelchair collided with a nearby table leg and toppled. The crash resonated throughout the room. Coffee cups shattered. A tray of utensils clattered to the ground. Maggie struck the floor hard, her artificial limb twisting beneath her body collapsing awkwardly. Time seemed suspended. Jessica covered her mouth, her legs refusing to move. Maggie lay sprawled across the floor. One hand steadied herself against the tiles. The other reached instinctively for her scattered belongings. A folded handkerchief, a leather wallet, and a small worn photograph of her former unit now fluttering beneath a nearby chair. Her expression revealed nothing, but Jessica detected it in her eyes. Pain, humiliation, something deeper than either. Nobody assisted, not even the elderly couple by the window. Just silence until a small voice whispered, Dad, is she a soldier? Like you were. Jessica turned. It was a young boy, perhaps 8 years old, sitting with his parents near the distant window. The father wore a battle-worn jacket with desert campaign patches. His eyes were fixed on Maggie, then shifted sharply toward Brent and his group. Yes, son, he said after an extended pause, and from the looks of it, a genuine one. He stood quietly but purposefully, retrieved his phone. I need to make a call, he informed his wife. He stepped outside. Jessica finally moved. She hurried to Maggie's side, but the older woman was already pushing herself upright with mechanical precision, lifting her wheelchair with the practiced strength of someone who had done it countless times. Are you okay? Jessica whispered, kneeling beside her. Maggie nodded once. I'm fine. But her jaw was clenched, her knuckles white. Behind them, Brent released a fake yawn. Man, these floor performances keep improving. Jessica turned toward him. You need to leave. Brent smirked. Or what? And that's when the door creaked open again. Jessica's breath caught. A sound rumbled into the parking area. Deep, heavy, unmistakable. A military transport vehicle and 3 silhouettes emerged. The gravel outside crunched beneath thick military tires. Every head in the Freedom Bell eatery turned toward the window, where sunlight reflected off the tan armor of a Marine vehicle pulling into the lot. It was an imposing machine, dust-streaked but undeniably official, and its mere presence seemed to alter gravity itself. The engine silenced, and 3 figures emerged in formation. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. First appeared a barrel-chested man with silver-streaked hair, trimmed regulation short, his left leg dragging slightly. He walked with a cane, not from weakness, but because he'd earned every painful step. His metals gleamed against his chest like captured lightning. Behind him, a tall young Marine pushed an empty wheelchair. His appearance was immaculate, but his eyes carried weight, the kind that came from witnessing too much too young. Last, a woman in captain's uniform. Her bearing radiated authority. The combat ribbons on her chest weren't decorative. Each step seemed to command space and silence. They walked in unison, one heartbeat, one purpose. The restaurant grew still. Brent Wallace's crew quieted mid-laugh. Jessica could sense it. The atmospheric shift, like a tempest had just entered wearing combat boots. The Marines didn't hesitate. They didn't scan the room seeking approval. They walked directly to the back corner to Maggie Dawson. The lead Marine halted precisely 3 feet from her table, squared his shoulders, and raised his hand in a salute sharp enough to divide moments. "Staff Sergeant Dawson, ma'am, please excuse our tardiness." Maggie blinked, her spine straightened as the instinct took control. She returned the salute, crisp and proud. "At ease, Master Sergeant," the older man smiled. "Not until this establishment remembers who you truly are." The young Marine beside him, a corporal, stepped forward with the empty wheelchair, but paused when he noticed Maggie's grip tighten on hers. He retreated respectfully. Captain Elena Rodriguez, the female Marine, surveyed the room, eyes settling on Brent and his companions. No words, just intensity. They shrank visibly. Jessica barely breathed. It was the most powerful silence she'd ever witnessed. From the booth near the window, the boy who had spoken earlier tugged his father's sleeve again. "Dad, those are genuine Marines, right?" The father, still standing near the entrance, phone lowered, answered softly. "Not just genuine, son. Those are family." Jessica's heart pounded as Captain Rodriguez turned to the staff. "4 coffees, black?" Yes, ma'am," she stammered, turning to the coffee pot with trembling hands. At Brent's table, the 4 men now sat rigidly. Their laughter had vanished. Their arrogance evaporated. Even the heavy-set man who had shoved Maggie suddenly seemed overly interested in his glass. The master sergeant, who introduced himself as Wilson, remained standing beside Maggie. "I received a call from Lieutenant Crawford. He mentioned one of our own was disrespected on civilian ground." "It's nothing," Maggie said quietly. "With all due respect," Wilson replied, voice unwavering, "it's not nothing." The corporal standing behind them shifted slightly. "Staff Sergeant Dawson led our convoy through Afghanistan when we encountered explosive devices. Saved my life and 4 others." Maggie looked up, startled. "Jenkins?" He nodded. "Still inexperienced, ma'am, but I never forgot your lessons." Jessica glanced around and witnessed the transformation. One by one, patrons began rising. An elderly gentleman in a Korean conflict cap, a woman in civilian attire with an Air Force pin. 2 younger men who had been silent in the back corner now stood as well, hands over hearts. And then came the command. "Attention!" It was Lieutenant Crawford, the boy's father, who had returned from his call. Half the restaurant snapped to attention. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't rehearsed. It was authentic. Brent shifted uncomfortably in his booth, his smug expression now fractured with confusion. The man who had shoved Maggie swallowed audibly, his eyes darting toward the exit as if escape remained possible. "Staff Sergeant Dawson," Captain Rodriguez said, "sacrificed her leg rescuing Afghan children from a burning vehicle. She earned the Bronze Star with valor, 23 years of distinguished service." Maggie's voice was low. "That chapter of my life has concluded." Captain Rodriguez knelt slightly, just enough to meet her gaze. "The Corps never leaves you, ma'am. We don't abandon our own." Jessica's hands trembled again, but this time not from fear, from pride. Dave, the manager, finally emerged from the kitchen. He surveyed the scene, then hurried toward the Marines. "Your meals." "They're complimentary, naturally." Master Sergeant Wilson didn't blink. "Marines honor their debts, sir. Always have, always will." Behind the counter, Jessica fought back tears. The coffee pot steamed. The boy, Tommy, leaned close to his dad. "Can I create something for her?" His father smiled. "You absolutely should, son." Maggie sat taller now. Her shoulders relaxed, but her eyes were more focused. She looked around and for the first time truly observed the room. They were standing for her, and for the first time in years she felt acknowledged. The silence that followed wasn't merely respectful, it was corrective, as if the entire room was realigning itself around truth. Maggie Dawson sat motionless, shoulders squared, lips pressed together. But her eyes, they moved, scanning, reading expressions. There was no pity in them, only assessment, recognition. And for the first time since the vehicle arrived, she spoke not just to the Marines, but to everyone present. "I never requested this," she said quietly, "but I appreciate your presence." Master Sergeant Wilson nodded once. "We don't arrive because you ask, ma'am. We come because you're one of us." The words anchored themselves. Maggie turned to Jenkins, the young corporal who still stood erect, hands behind his back as if on base. "You were the recruit in the second vehicle," she said, "the one who attempted to repair the radio under enemy fire." Jenkins gave a modest nod. "I had no idea what I was doing." "You kept your head down. That's what mattered," Maggie replied. Rodriguez smiled slightly, her voice interjecting. "They informed me afterward that you dragged Jenkins to safety after the initial explosion, pulled him by his protective vest with one hand while providing covering fire with the other." Jessica stared in disbelief. That detail wasn't included in the report. The Marines exchanged a glance, the kind that communicated, "We were present. We needn't explain to outsiders." Brent from his corner cleared his throat loudly, but it wasn't defiant anymore. It was nervous. He leaned over to whisper something to one of his companions. The man nodded, half standing, as if preparing to leave. But Master Sergeant Wilson turned, and his voice, still controlled, froze him in place. "Remain seated," Brent glared at him. "You can't dictate our actions. We're civilians." "You forcibly removed a disabled veteran from her wheelchair," Wilson replied, gaze unwavering. "With witnesses present. In my assessment, that constitutes assault." "Contact law enforcement then," Brent sneered. Jessica's voice resonated before she could restrain herself. "Already completed." All eyes turned toward her. "I called immediately after she hit the floor," she stated, displaying her phone. "They're en route." Captain Rodriguez turned toward Jessica. Her expression remained unchanged, but her eyes softened slightly. "Intelligent decision," she said. Maggie rotated her wheelchair slightly to face Jessica. "You contacted them?" Jessica swallowed nervously. "I couldn't simply watch passively." Something flickered across Maggie's features, like a fracture forming in granite. "Thank you." Just then, the restaurant door opened again. Two police officers entered, their eyes immediately recognizing the unusual, tense arrangement of the room. Standing patrons, uniformed Marines, and a table of grown men shrinking in their booth. Jessica didn't even need to explain. She simply indicated Maggie. The lead officer, Sheriff Halden, had served in the National Guard himself. His gaze shifted to the prosthetic limb, then to the overturned chair that Jessica had quietly repositioned. He approached slowly. "Maggie," he said softly, "are you all right?" "I'm fine," she responded. "But they aren't." Brent jumped up, hands raised. "This is absurd. We were just joking around. It's a misunderstanding." Halden looked at Master Sergeant Wilson, then at Captain Rodriguez, then back at Brent. "Step outside, all of you." As the four men vacated the booth, heads lowered, Jessica noticed the atmosphere lighten, as if someone had finally opened a window. Maggie exhaled slowly. Jessica moved closer. "They won't return here." Maggie remained silent. She was examining the photograph that had been returned to her earlier, the faded image of her former unit, edges worn from years in her wallet. Jessica sat cautiously at the edge of the booth. "That's your squadron?" Maggie nodded. "Do you miss them?" Maggie's eyes remained fixed on the photo. "Every single day." Jessica hesitated. "What happened?" "If you don't mind my asking." A prolonged silence, then quietly. "Two survived. One resides in Florida. One teaches high school in Kansas. The others, they remained in that valley, buried by the explosion." Jessica didn't know how to respond, so she said nothing. That seemed appropriate. Captain Rodriguez interrupted the moment. "We've reserved accommodations down the street for tonight. We'll return here tomorrow for lunch, if you don't mind our company." Maggie looked up. "That depends." "Are you paying?" Maggie inquired, her voice dry, but with the faintest smile. Rodriguez grinned. "You're damn right we are." Master Sergeant Wilson placed a small business card on the table. A handwritten number appeared on the reverse side. If ever the burden becomes excessive, you call, regardless of the hour. Jessica stared at the card as if it contained more than ink. Because it did. It contained a commitment. Outside, the sound of a police vehicle faded as Brent and his group were driven away. Inside, a new sound emerged, chairs scraping gently as patrons returned to their seats. But this time, many positioned themselves closer to Maggie's corner, and not one person occupied Brent's former booth. It was just after 6:15 when the final ray of sunlight disappeared behind the jagged Montana mountain range. Inside the Freedom Bell Eatery, the atmosphere had transformed. Not merely quiet now, but reverent. Patrons who had previously ignored the battle-scarred woman in the corner booth now leaned subtly toward her. Not intrusively, not with sympathy, but with something closer to admiration. Even Dave, the restaurant's manager, had exchanged his worn baseball cap for a clean button-up shirt and now moved with different energy. Not one of fear, but of correction. He'd made a mistake. He recognized it. "More coffee, Miss Dawson?" he asked gently, coffee pot already prepared. Maggie offered a polite nod. "Yes, please." Jessica observed the interaction with quiet satisfaction. For the first time, Maggie was being treated like the veteran she truly was, not the shadow people attempted to ignore. The Marines had remained longer than anyone anticipated. Their meals finished, their uniforms still immaculate, but their manner more relaxed now, like old comrades gathering at the one place where pretense was unnecessary. Jenkins leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Remember that province in Afghanistan? The sandstorm?" Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" "The one where we misplaced the convoy map and you navigated us back to headquarters using stars." Captain Rodriguez chuckled. "She didn't merely navigate. She corrected the GPS with a compass and determination." Jessica smiled from the counter. "Wait, that actually occurred?" Maggie sipped her coffee. "They provide plenty of technology. Doesn't mean you stop thinking." Jessica leaned closer, drawn to the narrative. "Were you always on the front lines?" Maggie paused. Her voice emerged softer this time. "Combat medic. Most of my deployments embedded with infantry units." Rodriguez glanced over with evident pride. "She treated our injuries more times than I can remember, including mine." "What happened?" Jessica asked before she could stop herself. Rodriguez glanced toward Maggie. "Would you prefer telling it?" Maggie remained silent initially. Her hand curled slightly around her mug. Then quietly, "Explosive device detonated near a village. We were securing an aid convoy route. Elena, Captain Rodriguez, suffered shrapnel wounds across her ribs. Severe. I heard the explosion and rushed into danger. Pulled her behind a vehicle and controlled the bleeding with a belt and an old shirt." Jessica blinked in amazement. "With just a shirt?" Rodriguez nodded, smiling. "Still have the scar. Still owe her dinner for it." Jenkins leaned forward. "That wasn't even the most incredible incident. Remember the ambush outside that settlement?" Rodriguez laughed softly. "Absolutely. She climbed through the top hatch while we were pinned down by enemy fire and created a smokescreen. Bought sufficient time for evacuation helicopters to land." Jessica stared in disbelief. "How do people not know these things about her?" Rodriguez gave her a meaningful look. "Because she doesn't share them." From her seat, Maggie offered the barest shrug. "Some experiences aren't meant for public display." The words lingered behind the counter. Melissa Oy, the newly hired teenage waitress, had remained quiet throughout the evening. But now as she listened, her eyes filled with something resembling shame. She emerged from the back and slowly approached Maggie's table. "I'm sorry," she blurted. Everyone looked up. Melissa twisted her apron nervously. "Earlier when they were mocking you, I should have intervened or objected, but I froze." Maggie's expression remained unreadable momentarily. Then, "You're not the first to freeze. Just ensure it doesn't recur." Melissa nodded, swallowing hard. "I won't." Maggie reached into her coat pocket and retrieved an old cloth emblem, faded but still legible. "Field Medic U.S. Marines." She handed it to Melissa. "If you're ever genuinely interested in understanding what that signifies, begin by listening." Melissa accepted the patch as if it were crafted from precious metal. Jessica, watching from behind the coffee machine, felt her throat constrict. Something was transforming here, not just for Maggie, but for everyone present. And perhaps, Jessica considered, it had required a moment of cruelty to unveil something sacred. Dave returned from the back carrying a clipboard. "I'm updating our wall," he said, gesturing toward the newly cleared space above the dessert display. "We're arranging photographs of local veterans with identification plates, ranks, possibly brief descriptions of their service." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "You're finally prepared to acknowledge this establishment serves more than just pie." He laughed nervously. "It serves the narratives now." Jessica glanced at Maggie. "Do you have an image we could display?" Maggie hesitated, then extracted from her wallet the creased photograph, the one that had scattered across the floor hours earlier, the one showing everyone before warfare had fractured their bond. Rodriguez examined it. "This one will serve perfectly." Melissa smiled broadly. "Could we duplicate it and position it above your booth?" Maggie raised an eyebrow. "For what purpose?" "So people remember what genuine courage resembles." That caught Maggie unprepared. She nodded once, the smallest but most sincere approval Jessica had witnessed from her yet. And in that modest restaurant, situated between a gas station and a fishing supply shop, a new kind of heritage was being inscribed. One that required neither medals nor speeches, just honesty and perhaps a slice of dessert. By the following Thursday, information had circulated, not just regarding the incident, but about what transpired afterward. It wasn't the fall from the wheelchair that people continued discussing. It was how the Marines had entered, how half the restaurant had stood, how even Sheriff Halden had saluted her quietly before departing. It wasn't scandal people whispered about. It was honor, and that transformed everything. Now, whenever Maggie wheeled in for a shift, someone held the door for her, not from pity, but with a respectful nod, an unspoken acknowledgement. And the area near her booth now featured a small brass plaque reserved for veterans. Nobody dared occupy it. Jessica noticed the difference most significantly in how regular customers treated her. Old Earl from the agricultural cooperative used to grunt when she passed. Now he'd offer his seat. Teenagers who once snickered behind phones now tucked them away when she approached. It wasn't performative. It was genuine transformation. And then the military vehicle returned. Same time, same sound, same dust trail spiraling skyward. Captain Elena Rodriguez exited first, sunglasses concealing her expression until she entered the restaurant. Then she smiled, warm and genuine. "Are Thursdays still our arrangement?" she asked. Maggie looked up from her usual position. "You're 5 minutes behind schedule." Jenkins followed, carrying a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. He placed it on the table between them. "We brought something special." Jessica watched from behind the counter, intrigued. Maggie raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Jenkins glanced at Captain Rodriguez, who answered, "Your medal's original issue." Maggie froze. "Pardon?" Rodriguez nodded. "The Veterans Administration finally located the correct documentation. I expedited the process. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Distinguished Service Medal, all legitimately earned, now officially recognized." Maggie stared at the package. Nobody moved. Jessica's breath caught as Maggie reached forward with both hands. She didn't open it. She simply held it. Her hands trembled slightly. Jenkins lowered his voice. "You always maintained the work mattered more than recognition, and we believe that. Still do." But Captain Rodriguez added gently, "There's nothing inappropriate about allowing people to witness the truth." Maggie didn't shed tears. She never did. But Jessica observed it, the flicker in her expression, the deep breath, the way her shoulders lifted slightly as if an invisible burden had been partially relieved. Melissa approached quietly with coffee. She placed it before each Marine and paused beside Maggie. "Could we display them?" Maggie glanced up. "The medals," Melissa clarified, "beside the photograph on the wall." Jessica anticipated Maggie's customary dry sarcasm, a shrug, a dismissive gesture. But instead she nodded. "Yes, that would be acceptable." and so the display expanded. By day's end, the Freedom Bell Eatery featured 15 photographs secured to the previously empty wooden panel, all local veterans, young and old, with names, ranks, and service periods. Maggie's image occupied the central position. Beneath it, a velvet display case now housed her medals. People began visiting not merely for meals, but to read, to learn, to honor. That Saturday, a representative from the high school stopped by. "I heard about your interaction with that young man," she said to Maggie, "and I wondered, would you address our graduating class regarding your military experience?" Maggie nearly declined, but something inside had shifted. "If they're prepared to listen," she said, "I'll speak." Word circulated quickly. The school arranged seating. The gymnasium reached capacity. Jessica attended too. So did Dave. Even Earl from the cooperative arrived wearing clean flannel and pressed denim. Maggie positioned herself at the front, her wheelchair flanked by the same Marines who had defended her days earlier. She didn't discuss bloodshed or suffering or decorations. She discussed discipline, teamwork, perseverance when nobody was observing. And when she concluded, the audience rose again. Not because they were instructed to, but because they comprehended. The following Thursday, Tommy, the young boy from the restaurant, returned with his father. He presented Maggie with an illustration, crayons on heavy paper. It depicted a woman in uniform seated in a wheelchair, holding medals in her lap. Behind her stood 3 Marines. Above everything was a sun, bright yellow, and the words, "True heroes never stand isolated." Maggie smiled genuinely that day, not just a polite curl of the lips, but a complete, authentic smile. Jessica noticed it. Melissa became emotional. Something had healed. Something continued healing. Later that evening, as the Marines finished their coffee and the town's customary quietness began returning, Captain Rodriguez placed another folded document on the table, sealed. Maggie examined it suspiciously. "Another surprise?" Rodriguez smiled. "Just correspondence from someone from your past." Maggie opened it carefully. The handwriting was familiar, precise. "You once rescued me without questioning. Now I reciprocate." ER double quote. Her hand paused on the signature. Rodriguez offered no explanation. Jenkins simply smiled, and outside the military vehicle waited, prepared to transport them home or wherever duty summoned next. But for Maggie Dawson, home had finally begun to feel like what it once promised to be: secure, acknowledged, and standing tall, even while seated. By mid-April, the Freedom Bell Eatery was no longer merely a roadside stopping point. It had transformed into something entirely different, a living memorial for the community's veterans. The brass plaque at Maggie Dawson's corner booth now gleamed in the morning light. "In honor of those who served and those who continue bearing the burden." Above it, her photograph had been enlarged, framed in dark walnut. The medals rested beneath in a case lined with navy velvet. But beyond that, the walls had expanded. Dozens of photographs now lined the restaurant's perimeter. From black and white portraits of World War II soldiers to faded images from Iraq and Afghanistan, every military branch had representation. Customers would pause before being seated, examining the faces as if browsing through living historical documents. Jessica had begun adding narratives and names beneath each one. She printed them on parchment and inserted them into brass holders below the frames. Dave offered veterans a discount. No fanfare, just a discreet line on the menu. "If you've worn the uniform, your coffee is complimentary." Melissa had progressed further. She'd begun recording interviews, brief conversations with veterans who visited. She stored them on a computer Dave purchased for her and planned to create a digital archive. She named it Voices of Pine Ridge. "I want people to hear their stories," she told Maggie one evening. "Not just view a photograph. I want them to understand what you all endured." Maggie simply nodded. She disliked discussing herself, but she appreciated what Melissa was developing. And then one evening, everything transformed again. It was a quiet Tuesday. No Marines, no speeches, just Maggie folding napkins between shifts while Jessica restocked cream containers. The doorbell chimed and a man entered. Late 50s, slender build, hair predominantly gray, gaze penetrating. He wore civilian clothes, jeans, plaid shirt, and boots covered with old dust. But Maggie looked up and the napkin in her hand froze. Jessica noticed it too. Something, something in Maggie's expression flickered. Not fear, not anger, astonishment. He approached gradually. "Hello, Margaret." Maggie remained silent. "Never expected to find you in an establishment like this," he said softly. Still no response. He reached inside his jacket and retrieved a folded envelope, placed it on her table. "I won't linger," he said. "Just needed to meet your gaze." Jessica remained motionless. Melissa stood frozen behind the dessert display. Maggie finally spoke, her voice low. "You perished in that province." The man, tall and solemn, released a breath that resembled confession. "Everyone believed I had." "You were classified as killed in action," Maggie stated. He nodded. "I allowed that designation to persist." Jessica's mouth opened, then closed. She felt like she was watching a personal apparition walk through someone's entrance. "Why?" Maggie asked. The man's gaze lowered. "Because I couldn't confront it." "What? What happened? What I abandoned?" A prolonged silence. Then Maggie said, "We buried an empty casket." He nodded again. "I'm aware." Nobody moved. Finally, Maggie picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a photograph, their former unit, identical to the one in her wallet, but this one had a message inscribed on the reverse. "You were our foundation. I was merely background noise." Jessica stepped away to provide privacy. When she returned minutes later, the man had departed, and Maggie was weeping silently, head bowed, shoulders trembling. But it wasn't grief, it was release. She dried her eyes and looked up. "He was our communications specialist. We believed he perished in that secondary explosion. We never recovered remains, just his helmet." Jessica sat beside her, saying nothing. Maggie examined the photograph again. Apparently, some ghosts return. That Thursday, the Marines returned, not merely for coffee this occasion. They brought something more significant. Master Sergeant Wilson had arranged a ceremony, informal yet powerful. They didn't wear dress uniforms, just their service attire and boots that still carried distant desert sand. The restaurant closed early. Seating was rearranged. Locals entered quietly, many with flags tucked into shirt pockets or decorations pinned to jackets. Jessica stood behind the counter, heart racing. Rodriguez approached the microphone. Nothing elaborate, just one borrowed from the high school gymnasium. "Today we aren't honoring history," she began. "We're acknowledging those still present among us, even when society attempted to forget them." She looked at Maggie, seated near the window. "You maintained our unity when dust obscured everything, when commands ceased, when terror threatened to fracture us. You preserved our wholeness." Jessica wiped her cheek. "So did Dave," Rodriguez continued. "And you accomplished it silently. No decorations, no narratives, just obligation." Rodriguez stepped aside. Jenkins took her position. "I was 19 when she rescued me. I barely knew proper shaving technique, and she extracted me from burning wreckage as if I held value." His voice cracked. "She demonstrated what courage embodies. It doesn't shout. It doesn't force entry. It simply persists." He turned toward Maggie. "Staff Sergeant Dawson, we remember and will continue remembering. Every Thursday, every time someone pours coffee and occupies your booth, we'll understand." The crowd stood again.